Hello everyone, and welcome to the Complex Cine channel. If you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Today, we are going to discuss the movie Jagal Tak Terkalahkan nonton online. The screen flickers to life, immediately immersing us in the gritty, high-stakes world of Indonesian underground fighting, a place where reputation is currency and survival is a daily negotiation. We are introduced to Bima, a young man whose sheer physical presence hints at a history forged in rigorous training, perhaps stemming from a deep-seated need to prove himself in a society that often overlooks the invisible. His journey isn't merely about winning bouts, it's about navigating the treacherous landscape orchestrated by powerful, shadowy figures who see human potential only as a commodity. Bima's entry into this brutal arena seems almost predestined, a path illuminated by flashes of extraordinary, almost instinctual fighting skill. We soon learn he is mentored, or perhaps managed, by someone whose own past in the fighting world remains shrouded, suggesting a history of unfulfilled potential or past glories that now fuel his guidance of Bima. This mentor figure often speaks in clipped sentences, their wisdom born from hard-won experience rather than academic study, echoing the raw authenticity required to survive in the fighting circuit, much like a seasoned choreographer guiding a dancer toward their defining performance. The narrative tightens as Bima catches the eye of the untouchable kingpin, a man whose influence stretches far beyond the ropes of the fighting cage. This antagonist is portrayed with a chilling calmness, a man whose control over the underground economy mirrors the precision he demands from his enforcers. His empire is built on a complex web of debt, loyalty, and fear, a structure as meticulously planned as a grand strategic game. It's clear that capturing Bima's talent is crucial to maintaining this fragile power balance. As Bima rises through the ranks, each victory demanding a piece of his soul, the personal stakes escalate. We see glimpses of a life outside the ring, perhaps a family member in need, or a past transgression that needs to be erased, providing the emotional ballast that keeps him grounded, preventing him from becoming just another automaton programmed for violence. The training montages, often cliché in lesser films, here feel visceral, emphasizing the sheer physical toll and the relentless self-discipline required. Bima isn't just building muscle, he's hardening his resolve, drawing inspiration perhaps from national martial arts heroes whose legacy demands unwavering commitment. The core conflict builds toward the inevitable confrontation. Bima realizes that simply winning matches isn't enough. He must dismantle the system itself. His idealism clashes directly with the cynical pragmatism of the syndicate bosses. The final fight sequence is not just a display of athleticism, it's a philosophical battle. Every punch thrown is a rejection of the exploitation inherent in the underground scene. The choreography is sharp, relentless, reflecting the influence of master martial artists whose life work is dedicated to transforming combat into an art form, demanding perfect timing and devastating efficiency. In the denouement, Bima emerges, battered but unbroken. The victory isn't simply over his final opponent, it's over the system that tried to consume him. The ending suggests a hard-earned peace, a quiet understanding that true strength lies not just in the ability to fight, but in the wisdom to choose when and why to engage. He walks away, leaving the shadowed world behind, having carved out a space for genuine autonomy in a landscape designed to suppress it. It's a testament to resilience, a story whispered on the wind of the Indonesian streets about the fighter who refused to stay defeated. The atmosphere surrounding Bima is thick with unspoken danger, a tangible pressure that seems to cling to his worn training gear. His eyes, when not focused in the white-hot intensity of a bout, hold a deep, almost unsettling stillness, the kind that comes from having stared into the void of true desperation. One can sense that the initial spark that drove him to this life, perhaps a quest for honor for a disgraced family name, or the simple need to secure medicine for a loved one, has now transformed into a relentless, internal engine. He moves with an economy of motion, his physical training clearly rooted in disciplines emphasizing practical application over flashy display, reminiscent of old-school fighters who understood that flash fades, but solid fundamentals endure. His manager, who we might imagine having a past involving a near-miss career in international cinema fighting, now channels all that raw potential energy into Bhima. This mentor often carries the weariness of a man who has seen too many promising careers dissolve into tragedy or corruption, offering advice like cryptic warnings against the temptations of easy money and the false promise of loyalty from the syndicate. There's a palpable tension between the manager's cautionary history and Bhima's youthful, almost reckless optimism, a dynamic that keeps the audience constantly wondering if the mentor's past failures are about to become Bhima's future reality. The main antagonist, the unseen puppet master controlling the tournament circuit, exudes a type of power that doesn't rely on shouting or visible aggression. He operates from impeccably sterile environments, a stark contrast to the blood-soaked canvas where Bhima earns his living. This villain's inspiration seems drawn from ruthless modern business moguls, viewing human conflict as pure arbitrage. He enjoys the intellectual game of manipulation, seeing Bhima not as a threat, but as his most valuable, albeit volatile, asset. The closer Bhima gets to the top, the more intricate the web of psychological traps becomes, designed less to physically defeat him, and more to break his moral compass. As Bhima racks up victories, the film allows us intimate, fleeting moments outside the arena. Perhaps we see him sharing a quiet, traditional meal with an elderly relative whose pride in him is tempered by fear for his soul, or maybe a brief, almost painful interaction with a former love who represents the simple, honest life he has sacrificed. These emotional anchors are crucial. They illustrate that the fight is never just for a purse, but for the right to reclaim a normal existence. The physical toll is evident in the constant wrapping of hands, the subtle limp that never quite goes away, the exhaustion that lingers even after a win. The climax approaches with the inevitable realization that the game is fixed at the highest level. Bhima's escalating fame means his victories are now funding the very system he despises. The final confrontation is framed as a deeply personal reckoning. We sense the influence of legendary Indonesian martial arts cinema, where the fight scene is often the culmination of character development. Every block and every counter signifies a moral decision made or a piece of self-doubt overcome. The sheer physicality of the final duel is overwhelming, a desperate ballet of survival against a highly skilled opponent, likely one of the syndicate's long-serving, loyal enforcers whose loyalty is tragically misplaced. Bhima wins not through brute force alone, but by finding the single precise opening that shatters the carefully constructed illusion of the antagonist's invincibility. He leaves the ring not as a champion crowned by the system, but as a self-liberated individual, carrying the scars of his journey as badges of honor, having proven that even in the darkest, most controlled environments, individual will can carve out a space for freedom. The air in the training hall hangs heavy, thick with the scent of sweat, old leather, and something sharper. Perhaps the metallic tang of old blood that seems to permeate the very foundations of these underground venues. Bhima's presence in the gym is almost monastic. He performs his shadow boxing not as practice, but as a form of meditation, each movement precise, stripped of any wasted energy. We begin to understand that his dedication is less about ambition and more about an inherent, almost spiritual need for physical control in a life otherwise spiraling out of control. His inspiration may well be drawn from the disciplined, near-mythical figures of Indonesian pencaksilat masters, whose dedication transcended mere sport, embedding a philosophy of resilience into every posture. His manager, a man whose face looks carved from disappointment, carries himself with the stiff posture of someone trying to keep secrets buried deep within his own spine. He constantly monitors Bima, not just his technique, but his emotional baseline, acutely aware that in this world, a flicker of arrogance or a moment of uncontrolled rage can be fatal. We might speculate that this manager once tasted fame, perhaps an opportunity to star in a major action film that fell through due to a bad contract or a betrayal, leaving him forever wary of the glamour Bima is now beginning to attract. He coaches Bima on survival tactics that go beyond the fight itself, how to look the right people in the eye, and more importantly, how to look away from others. The syndicate boss, whose power is amplified by his calculated detachment, views Bima's success as a testament to his own superior organizational skills. He's the kind of man who prefers to watch destruction on a monitor rather than in person, finding the visceral messiness distasteful, but the resulting financial gain exquisite. His office, perhaps overlooking the city lights, a view Bima can only dream of, is a fortress of quiet menace. This antagonist's inspiration seems rooted in corporate espionage and ruthless market domination. For him, Bima is simply the highest yield stock in his portfolio. The emotional pressure mounts when the boss starts subtly targeting Bima's quiet anchors. The elderly relative might suddenly face an impossible tax demand, or a crucial supply of medication might mysteriously vanish, forcing Bima to fight not just for himself, but for the very infrastructure of his few remaining connections to decency. The emotional weight of Bima's path is etched onto his body. Beyond the visible bruises, there is the weariness in his shoulders, the way he winces slightly when turning too quickly. Small, private acknowledgments of the battles already lost internally. When he interacts with the outside world, his speech is hesitant, as if the language of violence has made him clumsy with words of kindness. Yet, in these brief interludes, the audience sees flashes of the good man he is trying to save, a gentle hand offered to steady a falling object, or an unexpected moment of patience with a child. These small acts serve as reminders of what he is fighting to return to. The final confrontation moves beyond simple aggression into a space of existential clarity for Bima. He realizes the final opponent is not just a rival fighter, but a mirror, a man who fully submitted to the system and reaped the rewards of complicity. The fight. Choreography becomes a narrative device, reflecting Bima's internal struggle. Does he adhere to the clean, traditional strikes he learned, or does he resort to the dirty, pragmatic violence the syndicate demands? Drawing heavily from classic Indonesian cinema, where the hero often wins by utilizing an environment or a hidden weapon, a piece of hidden knowledge, Bima finds an unconventional path to victory. He doesn't just overpower his opponent, he outthinks the entire structure the opponent represents. Emerging from the darkness of the ring, Bima walks into the harsh, unfiltered light of the early morning, no longer defined by the blood on his hands, but by the resolute steadiness of his gaze, finally free to define his own legacy on terms he dictated, not terms that were assigned to him. The aftermath of the final, brutal engagement leaves Bima standing amidst the wreckage of the underground's fragile order, the silence of the arena now deafening after the roar of the crowd. He is not celebrating. Rather, there is a profound, almost desolate calm settling over him. The victory feels less like triumph and more like necessary amputation. He has cut away a massive, toxic part of his life, and the wound is deep and raw. His first moments of freedom are heavy with the weight of the choices made, the necessary cruelties inflicted. He looks down at his hands, the same hands that have built and destroyed, and a brief, fleeting moment of self-reproach crosses his face, the kind of look reserved for confronting one's own capacity for darkness. The manager, perhaps witnessing the final, pure act of defiance, seems to finally shed some of his ingrained cynicism. There is a brief, almost paternal acknowledgement, a nod that speaks volumes more than any drawn-out speech, suggesting that Bhima has achieved what the manager himself never could, escape with his essential self intact. This departure is quiet, devoid of fanfare. The underground world, like any ecosystem suddenly stripped of its apex predator, begins to quietly reorganize, already forgetting the details of Bhima's rise and fall, eager to find the next commodity. Bhima's journey back to the periphery of normal society is slow, marked by an almost childlike inability to interact with simple comforts. The bright sunlight seems too loud. The polite conversations feel like another form of coded threat. He seeks out the quietest corners, perhaps finding refuge in a remote area where the sounds of the city and the shadows of the syndicate cannot easily penetrate. His physical healing will take time, but the emotional reintegration is the true challenge. He is haunted by the memory of the lives he disrupted and the violence he unleashed, understanding that even a righteous fight leaves indelible stains. The film subtly suggests that Bhima's future will be one of vigilant quietude. He understands the nature of power too intimately now to ever fully trust institutions or easy promises. His true legacy won't be found in headlines, but in the consistent, small acts of integrity that rebuild a fractured spirit. Perhaps he dedicates his formidable skills to something entirely constructive, maybe coaching underprivileged youth in a discipline far removed from the cage-fighting scene, channeling that intensity into building character rather than breaking bones. It is a quiet commitment, a vow whispered to the dawn, that the power earned through survival will now be used solely for preservation, not for conquest. The final image is not of a champion raising a belt, but of a solitary figure walking toward a distant horizon, finally in command of his own narrative, the scars of his journey serving as an unwritten memoir of resilience against exploitation. The quiet that follows Bhima's victory is not the silence of peace, but the tense hush preceding a storm, or perhaps the emptiness left after a massive structure collapses. He moves through the immediate aftermath with a heavy deliberation, his body a map of exhaustion and minor triumph. The arena lights, which moments before felt like scorching interrogation lamps, now seem pale and indifferent. One can imagine the crowd, a tapestry of drawn faces fueled by vicarious adrenaline, dispersing quickly, their investment in the spectacle concluded, leaving Bhima alone with the physical residue of his exertion, the grit beneath his fingernails, the labored rhythm of his breathing. His initial act is one of self-preservation, a primal need to put distance between himself and the location of his near destruction, moving with the instinct of prey that has temporarily evaded the jaws of the hunter. The manager's silent acknowledgement carries the weight of a lifetime of regrets finally being eased by proxy. This man, who perhaps dreamed of the disciplined artistry of classic martial arts cinema, but ended up hustling in the shadows, finds a strange redemption in Bhima's escape. He doesn't try to re-engage Bhima in conversation about next steps or potential endorsements. He understands that Bhima has just made a conscious choice to erase that entire trajectory. The parting is almost reverent, a recognition that the protege has succeeded where the mentor faltered, choosing integrity over the intoxicating illusion of control offered by the syndicate. The manager then melts back into the infrastructure, perhaps to witness the inevitable, messy fallout among the remaining power players, his own role diminishing now that the main attraction has left the stage. Bhima's re-entry into the world of the unsanctioned is characterized by a deep sense of cultural alienation. The honest, everyday interactions, buying food from a street vendor, navigating traffic, feel overly complex, requiring a level of nuanced social navigation he hasn't practiced in years. He views the world through the lens of threat assessment, automatically cataloging escape routes and gauging the intent behind every glance. This hypersensitivity is the psychological toll of living constantly under siege. We sense a longing for the simplicity he once perhaps took for granted, a longing so sharp it verges on physical pain. The scars he carries are not just the broken ribs or torn ligaments, but the deep-seated understanding that trust is the most expensive commodity of all. His tentative steps toward normalcy are characterized by a need for profound, grounding routine. If he is to rebuild, it must be brick by brick, using the same discipline that made him an unbeatable fighter. The decision to mentor others is a necessary form of penance and self-therapy. He chooses the discipline that nearly destroyed him, Pencak Silat perhaps, but strips it bare of any association with violence for profit. In teaching a young student, the frustration of slow progress is countered by the deep satisfaction of seeing a nascent spark of genuine dedication, the antithesis of the forced commitment demanded by the syndicate. His teaching style is firm but infused with an empathy born from his own near fall, focusing relentlessly on the internal philosophy of the art rather than its external application. Bhima's ultimate victory is not surviving the final fight, but choosing to live a life where such a fight is never necessary again, a slow, deliberate act of defiance against the darkness he once mastered. The air around Bhima now carries a different kind of tension, the quiet hum of sustained vigilance rather than the frantic energy of impending conflict. He seeks out spaces where the architecture itself seems honest, perhaps preferring the stark, unadorned walls of old community centers or neglected public sports grounds to the opulent, deceptive structures favored by the syndicate. His movements, while still powerful, are now laced with an economy that suggests conservation of energy, not just for the next bout, but for the long haul of living justly. One might observe him engaging in repetitive, almost ritualistic physical tasks, mending fishing nets perhaps, or meticulously tending a small, difficult garden. Activities that demand patience and precision, allowing his mind to untangle the knotted threads of memory without demanding immediate physical response. The manager, having observed Bhima's graceful, self-directed exit, becomes an echo in the narrative, a spectral presence that confirms the weight of Bhima's achievement. We imagine him watching from a distance, perhaps from a dimly lit warung, seeing Bhima's quiet persistence and understanding that this enduring survival is the true, impossible win. The manager's own journey, steeped in the compromises required to survive in the periphery of Indonesian entertainment and action industries, never allowed for such a clean break. His continued presence in the shadows is his own testament to the system Bhima rejected. Bhima's rehabilitation is deeply internal. The hypersensitivity to external stimuli forces him inward, where he must confront the specter of the men he defeated, not as opponents, but as victims of the same machinery that sought to claim him. This realization introduces a layer of melancholy to his solitude. His former training, which emphasized dominating the physical sphere, proves inadequate for the nuances of emotional reintegration. He struggles with the concept of being seen without being judged or valued for his fighting prowess. When he interacts with the world, his gaze is deliberately soft, an active effort to shed the predatory focus that kept him alive. He might find an unexpected connection with an elderly artisan or a quiet craftsman whose work demands slow, unhurried dedication, offering Bhima a template for rebuilding a life without urgency or spectacle. His decision to teach becomes an act of transmutation. He takes the very language of violence, the stances, the breath control, the explosive power, and redefines it as a framework for inner discipline and communal respect. The technical instruction is rigorous, echoing the demanding standards of master martial artists whose works are considered cultural treasures. But the underlying lesson is always about restraint. He emphasizes that the true measure of a fighter is not the ability to inflict pain, but the self-control required to withhold it when safety is assured. Bhima is no longer fighting for a purse or for survival against a physical threat. He is engaged in the existential fight to reclaim his own humanity, one disciplined, perfectly executed block at a time, ensuring that the darkness he conquered in the ring remains external to the life he is carefully, painstakingly constructing. The landscape Bhima now inhabits is one defined by meticulous small victories over habit and expectation. His teaching space, perhaps a rented, open-air pavilion near the coast, where the constant sound of the ocean provides a natural white noise to mask intrusive memories, becomes his new arena. Here, the discipline he once applied to surviving the syndicate's brutal schedule is redirected toward cultivating patience in his young students, many of whom come from backgrounds mirroring his own desperate need for structure and escape. He notices the subtle signs of aggression or fear in their nascent movements, recognizing the same raw materials he once possessed. His instructions are often delivered softly, demanding precision not for aesthetic appeal, but because he knows that in the world they inhabit, even outside the cages, a moment of hesitation can have dire consequences. His physical maintenance is no longer about achieving peak fighting weight, but about ensuring longevity and functionality. He moves stiffly after strenuous sessions, the deep, internal aches a constant reminder of the unsustainable nature of his past career. These pains are more honest than the fleeting cheers of a crowd, serving as tangible proof that violence extracts its fee regardless of the perceived righteousness of the cause. He avoids mirrors, understanding that the reflection is still too closely tied to the fighter persona, the weaponized version of himself the syndicate engineered. The syndicate itself, though seemingly dismantled by Bhima's defiance, lingers as an ambient threat, a low-frequency paranoia that never fully dissipates. He understands that power structures rarely vanish, they merely shift their geography and personnel. This knowledge informs his caution. He never settles too comfortably, never allows himself the luxury of absolute trust in his new environment. His self-imposed exile is a continuous, active choice, a recognition that true freedom is not the absence of chains, but the constant, self-aware refusal to place new ones upon oneself. The emotional catharsis arrives not in a grand dramatic scene, but in moments of shared vulnerability with his students. When one of them finally masters a difficult technique, the pure, unadulterated joy on the young face is a counterpoint to the grim satisfaction Bhima once felt. This genuine connection begins to mend the fractured sense of self. He realizes that by elevating others, by providing them a pathway that sidesteps the systemic exploitation he endured, he is retroactively validating the suffering he went through. His inspiration now is drawn from the idea of legacy, not the legacy of a violent champion, but the quiet, enduring legacy of a dedicated teacher who broke a cycle. He has traded the fleeting glory of the ring for the slow, difficult process of building something enduring in the quiet space between the ocean and the shore. The transition from celebrated brute to quiet instructor is fraught with internal contradictions. Bhima finds that the very skills that guaranteed his survival in the fighting pits, the hyper-alertness, the ability to read intent in the slightest muscle twitch, make ordinary life feel like navigating a minefield designed for the overly cautious. He teaches his students the art of looking small, of blending into the periphery, a lesson learned too late for his own initial entry into the underground. When addressing the cultural roots of their martial discipline, he speaks with a solemnity that suggests he is reciting sacred, nearly lost texts, conveying the philosophical depth that his past employers had deliberately ignored in favor of spectacle. He insists on grounding exercises that connect them physically to the earth, a deliberate countermeasure against the weightlessness of ambition and the ephemeral nature of fame. There are moments when the old Bhima surfaces involuntarily, a sudden loud noise, a hurried movement in his periphery, and his hands instinctively drop into a defensive posture, his breathing shallowing, a somatic memory asserting itself over conscious will. These flashes are brief but profoundly unsettling, prompting him to immediately retreat to more isolated physical exertion, perhaps performing punishing long-distance runs along the coast until the excess adrenaline burns off, leaving him physically depleted but mentally quieted. His body, trained to such an extreme peak, now rebels against the absence of mortal stakes, demanding a challenge commensurate with its former conditioning. The syndicate's influence, though unseen, continues to shape his environment. He anticipates that any prolonged period of peace will eventually attract unwanted attention, knowing that systems built on greed seldom tolerate loose ends or successful defections. This paranoia isn't debilitating. Rather, it's channeled into proactive defense, ensuring his teaching space remains unassuming and his personal life intentionally mundane. He keeps the location of his small residence deliberately vague, a practical application of the survival tactics learned from his manager, whose likely fate remains an unanswered question, a necessary sacrifice to the narrative's closure. His relationship with the students evolves into a surrogate family, filling the void left by the sacrifices he made for survival. He sees in their earnest, sometimes clumsy attempts at mastery a purer form of aspiration than anything he ever felt fighting for a title. The most rewarding moments are when a student finally understands that the true power of their discipline lies in its capacity for humility and ethical application. Bhima, who once felt dehumanized by being treated as a controllable asset, now invests his entire being into nurturing autonomy in others. He recognizes that breaking the cycle isn't about spectacular revenge, but about quietly fostering a generation equipped to resist the allure and the trap of transactional violence. His final enduring act is not one of physical conquest, but the slow, painstaking architecture of moral fortitude in the next generation, a legacy built on the bedrock of everything he nearly lost. The silence Bhima now cultivates is not passive. It is an active shield, a carefully constructed perimeter against the chaos he once embodied. He spends hours meticulously organizing the sparse training equipment, finding a deep, almost therapeutic satisfaction in order where there was once only brutal randomness. The very wood of the pavilion floor, worn smooth by the feet of hopefuls, seems to absorb the sound of his own heavy tread, muffling the potential resonance that might carry too far. His diet, once dictated by the harsh caloric demands of the weigh-ins, is now deliberately simple, focused on clean sustenance that requires no complex preparation, a metaphor for the uncluttered life he strives to maintain. When interacting with the local community, Bhima defaults to a practiced anonymity. He speaks only when necessary, his voice retaining a low register, as if perpetually mindful of not wanting to attract undue attention. His physical presence, however, remains undeniable. Even when relaxed, the coiled readiness in his posture speaks volumes about the level of conditioning required to operate at the apex of underground fighting. This duality, the quiet man masking a formidable weapon, is his new reality. He often finds himself drawn to the edges of community events, observing the easy flow of human connection, an outsider perpetually peering through a pane of soundproof glass, appreciating the warmth without daring to fully step into it. The deeper he settles into teaching, the more he recognizes the subtle, psychological artistry that his former manager possessed. He begins to interpret the manager's cryptic warnings not as pessimism, but as profound insights into the mechanics of control. This retrospective understanding allows Bhima to inoculate his students against sophisticated forms of manipulation, teaching them to recognize the slippery slope between ambition and servitude long before the contract is ever presented. He stresses the importance of documenting everything, an antithesis to the syndicate's reliance on secrecy and verbal agreements, a small act of systemic resistance embedded in mundane practice. Occasionally, a flicker of the old life tries to surface in his students, usually a gifted young fighter who shows an uncanny aptitude for decisive, brutal finishes. In these instances, Bhima becomes intensely demanding, pushing the student past exhaustion, forcing them to confront the physical consequences of unchecked aggression. He demands a shift in focus from winning the fight to ending the confrontation ethically. This is his most challenging pedagogical moment, channeling the raw survival instinct into something sustainable, something that serves life rather than terminates it. He is acutely aware that he is not just training martial artists. He is participating in the delicate act of redefining masculinity for a new generation, steering them away from the toxic validation found in dominance toward the strength found in self-mastery and restraint. The scars on his knuckles are now less marks of battle and more like ancient text, lessons he is slowly deciphering and rewriting for those who follow. The rhythm of Bhima's new life settles into a steady, predictable beat, a stark contrast to the violent erraticism of his past. The sun rising over the water, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the training pavilion, becomes his new clock. He finds a peculiar comfort in the fact that the ocean's tide is indifferent to his fears or his triumphs. It simply follows its course, a powerful natural law uncorrupted by human greed. This consistency is the scaffolding upon which he attempts to rebuild his internal world. He realizes that the true mastery in any discipline, be it fighting or living, lies in recognizing the patterns and choosing which ones to adhere to and which to intentionally disrupt. His interactions with his students occasionally touch upon the veiled subject of his former life, not through confession, but through cautionary analogy. When a student becomes overly reliant on a single powerful move, Bhima will recount, without specifics of names or places, the tale of how the most powerful weapon often becomes the most predictable weakness when facing a system designed to exploit predictability. He treats the study of combat like archaeology, carefully unearthing the original, pure intent of the martial arts, separating it from the layers of performance and brutality layered upon it by the underground circuit. This intellectual respect for the art form seems to heal a part of his own spirit that had felt debased by being reduced to mere spectacle. The quiet vigilance he maintains is occasionally tested by the faint echoes of the criminal world. A new face seen lingering too long at the edge of the practice grounds, a vehicle driving by too slowly. These moments cause a momentary spike in his awareness, a physical readiness that takes conscious effort to suppress. He understands that true erasure is impossible. He is a known quantity in certain circles. Yet the fear of discovery is now tempered by a newfound purpose. He is no longer fighting to keep himself alive. He is fighting to protect the integrity of the space he has created, a small, clean sanctuary against the rot. If confrontation were to find him, he would face it not with the desperate fury of a cornered animal, but with the measured precision of a master defending his craft. The most profound revelation for Bhima is discovering that vulnerability, when shared deliberately, is not a weakness, but a conduit for connection. He begins to speak more openly, not about the fights, but about the necessary choices, the ethical pivots that defined his final moments in the ring. He tells them that true strength isn't the ability to deliver a knockout blow, but the strength of character to walk away from the lucrative darkness and choose the difficult, often unrewarded path of integrity. This final stage of his journey is about legacy building through negation, defining himself by what he refuses to do, rather than what he was forced to become. The man who was once deemed Jagal Tak Terkalahkan, the unbeatable butcher, is slowly, deliberately, becoming simply Bhima, the teacher, finding his ultimate, quiet victory in the stillness between the breaths. The stillness Bhima now seeks is almost tangible, a deliberate creation against the relentless noise of memory. He views his teaching sanctuary not just as a gym, but as a meticulously engineered psychological buffer zone. The students, often drawn from the margins of urban poverty, look to him with an almost desperate reverence, seeing in his scarred knuckles and disciplined demeanor the blueprint for a life salvaged from ruin. Bhima meticulously avoids romanticizing the violence of his past. Instead, he frames it as a series of catastrophic engineering failures. He often uses analogies drawn from structural physics. A building that relies only on brute force for stability will always fall when the foundation is challenged. True strength is flexible. It yields only to redirect. This philosophy, deeply influenced by an abstract appreciation for traditional architecture, informs his entire teaching methodology. His physical regimen has shifted from explosive output to endurance and recovery. He performs long meditative walks before dawn, not for cardiovascular conditioning, but as a way to practice mindfulness, to allow invasive thoughts to drift by without anchoring themselves. The lingering physical ailments, the stiff knee, the phantom twinge in his shoulder, are no longer signs of failure, but badges of a life lived at the extremes, serving as concrete reminders of the system's cost. He treats his body less like a weapon and more like a high-performance engine that requires constant, nuanced maintenance, recognizing that longevity is now his greatest asset against the shadowy figures who prefer their assets ephemeral and disposable. The syndicate's influence, though absent, manifests in the scrutiny Bhima applies to his own surroundings. He employs a methodical approach to security that mirrors the organizational tactics of the criminal enterprise he escaped, but in reverse. Where they focused on surveillance and control, he focuses on invisibility and self-sufficiency. He maintains a deliberately low profile within the local community, cultivating relationships based on mutual respect for quiet labor rather than transactional loyalty. He never asks favors, and he offers help only in the context of training or shared communal upkeep, ensuring that no debt is ever incurred that could be leveraged against him. The subtle evolution of his emotional landscape is most visible in his capacity for forgiveness, particularly self-forgiveness. He realizes that the young man who entered the arena was a product of circumstance, and the fighter who emerged was a product of necessity. The guilt over choices made under duress begins to recede, replaced by a determined focus on ethical creation. When a young protege exhibits signs of ego or a taste for unnecessary aggression, Bhima doesn't punish with physical drills. Instead, he assigns them tasks that require prolonged acts of selfless service to the community, cleaning public spaces, caring for the elderly, forcing a confrontation between the desire for dominance and the requirement for humility. Bhima's ultimate triumph is achieving a state where his immense physical capability is permanently relegated to the background, a powerful tool kept locked away, while his quiet dedication to moral instruction takes center stage, ensuring that his hard-won freedom is not just for himself, but for the space he carved out for others to grow unafraid. The atmosphere around Bhima now possesses the deep, resonant quality of ancient stone, solid, quiet, and seemingly impervious to casual disturbance. His presence in the training pavilion has become less about instruction and more about immersion. He isn't just teaching the forms of Pencaksilat, he is embodying the philosophy of unmoving resolve. When he demonstrates a particularly complex defensive maneuver, his stillness before the explosive movement is absolute, a physical representation of the moment of decision before a catastrophic event, a pause he has practiced mastering in his own life. The students absorb this not just as technique, but as temperament, recognizing the profound effort required to hold such power in reserve. His physical maintenance has become a ritual of honoring the body's history. The scar tissue across his left knuckles, once a testament to shattering bone against bone, now feels like hardened history. He treats minor injuries not with aggressive countermeasures, but with prolonged, gentle applications of traditional remedies, herbal poultices, and slow massage, symbolizing his commitment to healing over brute force recovery. This slow attention to detail reveals a man who has learned that the most durable structures are those built with infinite patience, a stark contrast to the immediate, explosive solutions the fighting world prized. The memory of the syndicate remains not as an active threat, but as a shadow that informs his every precaution. He understands that true power rarely sends explicit threats. It relies on slow erosion. Bhima is vigilant against subtle forms of corruption entering his domain, not just physical threats, but the corrosive influence of expectation. If a local official shows too much interest in his successful youth program, Bhima tightens his guard, immediately shifting resources or adjusting the curriculum to make the venture seem less profitable or more difficult to control from the outside. His paranoia has sharpened into intuitive foresight, a constant, low-level hum of strategic defense. His mentorship is reaching a critical phase. The first students are beginning to achieve genuine mastery. This success brings Bhima a complex emotion, a surge of paternal pride mixed with an immediate, sharp anxiety about their future trajectory. He pulls aside the most promising talent, the one who naturally exhibits the explosive power he once possessed, and shares the most painful lesson. The cage is everywhere. You must learn to recognize when you are being paid not in money, but in permission to be aggressive. This is his final, crucial transfer of knowledge. The understanding that true liberation lies not in winning the fight, but in refusing to enter the manufactured conflict. He has become the gatekeeper to a higher discipline, ensuring that the fire he once contained does not simply jump to a new generation, but is instead transmuted into a steady, guiding light. Bhima's final narrative arc is less about escaping the darkness and more about becoming the immovable, quiet light source that prevents others from stumbling into it. The film, known in its localized context as Jagal Tak Terkalahkan, presents a fascinating, albeit raw, glimpse into the visceral world of Indonesian street fighting, layered with themes of desperation, honor, and the harsh realities faced by those on the fringes of society. It is a narrative steeped in the kinetic energy often associated with martial arts cinema, yet it eschews much of the stylized choreography for a more brutal, almost documentary-like portrayal of violence. The central performance anchors the film's emotional gravity. The actor, whose prior work often explored the nuances of the common man struggling against systemic indifference, perhaps drawing inspiration from the gritty realism championed by early Indonesian filmmakers concerned with social commentary, delivers a performance characterized by coiled tension. His physical commitment to the role is undeniable. The physicality required suggests a deep immersion into the preparation, likely involving extensive training that mirrors the practical, unpolished fighting styles depicted. This commitment grounds the spectacle, transforming the brawls from mere action sequences into desperate struggles for survival or validation. The directorial vision seems intent on stripping away the glamour often afforded to fight narratives. There is a noticeable rawness in the cinematography, utilizing handheld techniques that heighten the immediacy of the conflict. This aesthetic choice intentionally mirrors the unpredictable, chaotic nature of underground combat, refusing the viewer a comfortable distance. One can sense the influence of independent cinema traditions, favoring mood and atmosphere over glossy production values. This approach often requires the director to be exceptionally skilled at capturing authentic human reactions under duress, a tightrope walk between exploitation and genuine empathy. The supporting cast often reflects the varied ecosystem that surrounds such illicit sports. Characters orbiting the protagonist, trainers, bookmakers, and rivals, are sketched with enough detail to suggest a wider social tapestry, even if their screen time is limited. These secondary figures often serve as mirrors, reflecting the protagonist's own moral compromises or aspirations. If the film draws parallels to the inspirations fueling its creation, one might observe echoes of films that focus intensely on the psychological toll of sustained conflict, where winning is less about glory and more about escaping the next debt or feeding the next mouth. The thematic resonance of unbeatable in the title is deliberately provocative. True to many underdog narratives, the film suggests that invincibility is less about physical prowess and more about an unyielding psychological refusal to yield. The protagonist's journey is less about achieving an undefeated record and more about navigating moral gray areas where the rules of legitimate sport do not apply. The film cleverly uses the spectacle of violence to explore the economics of poverty. The fights are not just contests of strength, but necessary transactions in a system that offers few legitimate pathways upward. The narrative structure itself often feels cyclical, suggesting that escaping this cycle is the true, perhaps unreachable, victory. The lingering feeling after the credits roll is one of exhaustion rather than elation, a testament to the film's commitment to portraying the true cost of being undefeated in such a devastating arena. The atmosphere woven throughout Jagal Tak Terkalahkan is thick, almost palpable, smelling faintly of sweat, cheap liniment, and damp concrete. This is not the sanitized, brightly lit world of professional boxing. This is the shadowy underside where debts are settled with fists, and reputation is the only currency that matters. The emotional landscape of the protagonist is a study in muted desperation. His eyes, often framed tightly by the camera in close-up during moments of rest or contemplation, betray a weariness that far exceeds his apparent youth. One can almost trace the internal monologue, a silent negotiation between the need to win and the slow erosion of his own moral center. This emotional depth owes much to the tradition of Indonesian character dramas that privilege internal struggle over external bombast, even when staging explosive physical confrontations. Consider the antagonist, or perhaps more accurately, the primary obstacle. Often, in films of this nature, the rival embodies a pure, unadulterated aggression that the protagonist has managed, however tenuously, to control. If the protagonist fights out of necessity, the rival fights out of entitlement or a deeper, more ingrained cruelty. The way this secondary character moves, perhaps with an almost arrogant fluidity that speaks to superior resources or a less burdened past, provides a necessary foil. Their interactions aren't merely physical exchanges. They become dialectical arguments fought through impact, testing the protagonist's commitment to his own survival code against the raw expediency of winning at any cost. The sound design plays a crucial, often understated role in cementing the film's gritty realism. The sound of impact is rarely exaggerated. Instead, it's sickeningly dull, a wet thud against bone or yielding flesh, closer to a muffled drumbeat than a cinematic flourish. This meticulous attention to auditory detail forces the audience into an uncomfortable intimacy with the violence. It suggests a director deeply influenced by European realism, perhaps even the stark honesty found in some early Hong Kong crime dramas before the rise of heavily stylized wirework. The silence between the bursts of fighting is just as telling, filled only with heavy breathing, the shuffling of feet on sand-covered canvas, and the low, guttural encouragement from the ringside shadows. Furthermore, the setting itself functions as a character. The dingy, often makeshift arenas, a back room of a gambling den, an abandoned warehouse cornered off with ropes, are testaments to the societal neglect fueling these underground circuits. These spaces are transient, constantly on the verge of discovery or collapse, mirroring the precarious existence of those who fight within them. The debris on the floor, the exposed wiring, the single bare bulb illuminating the chaos. These elements build a portrait of a community existing just outside the reach of legitimate infrastructure. It elevates the central conflict from a personal fight to a commentary on structural exclusion, forcing the viewer to acknowledge that the unbeatable status is often just a temporary stay against economic ruin, and the film successfully transforms the physical arena into a metaphor for the protagonist's limited options in the wider world. The sheer kineticism of the fight choreography, while eschewing balletic grace for raw impact, reveals a studied knowledge of practical, close-quarters fighting. One can see the director's careful staging, ensuring that every successful blow carries the weight of consequence, not just for the recipient, but for the thrower's own rapidly depleting reserves of stamina and resolve. The protagonist, in his moments of triumph, rarely exhibits overt celebration. Instead, there is a brief, almost involuntary slump of the shoulders, the momentary release of held breath before the necessary preparation for the next engagement begins. This suggests a character profoundly aware that the temporary high of victory is immediately eclipsed by the looming reality of the next challenge and the next required performance. It speaks to a fatigue that is existential, not merely physical. The portrayal of the protagonist's personal life, fragmented as it may be, adds crucial dimensions to his motivation. If we glimpse brief scenes outside the fighting pit, perhaps a sparse apartment, a meager meal, or a necessary interaction with a family member whose welfare depends on his performance, these moments serve as stark counterpoints to the savagery he willingly engages in. This juxtaposition is vital. It prevents the character from becoming a mere fighting machine. His connection to the outside world, however fragile, defines the stakes. He fights not for sport, as an athlete might, but for continuity, for the right to simply exist without immediate catastrophic failure. This echoes the thematic backbone of certain classic neo-realist dramas, where survival itself becomes the highest form of dramatic achievement. The film's visual palette reinforces this emotional desaturation. Colors are muted, dominated by browns, deep reds suggestive of old blood and poor lighting, and harsh industrial grays. This stylistic decision effectively drains any potential heroism from the proceedings. Even when the protagonist wins decisively, the lighting does not magically brighten. The victory is immediately enveloped by the next layer of shadow. This deliberate anti-glamorization speaks to a directorial ambition to expose the machinery of exploitation. The crowd, often blurred in the periphery or reduced to menacing silhouettes, functions less as an audience and more as a collective hungry entity, their eagerness fueling the cycle. They are the abstract embodiment of the market forces that demand spectacle and sacrifice. Moreover, the film's editing pace is masterful in manipulating tension. During the build-up to a fight, sequences are often protracted, lingering on preparatory rituals, the wrapping of hands, the forced eye contact across the ring, stretching the psychological warfare until the physical violence feels like a necessary, almost anticlimactic eruption of pent-up dread. Conversely, key moments of decisive action are sometimes shockingly brief, swift executions of brutal efficiency that leave the viewer momentarily disoriented, mirroring the shock experienced by the combatants themselves. This fluctuating rhythm ensures that the audience is never allowed to settle into a comfortable viewing pattern, mirroring the protagonist's own unsettled state. The enduring impression left by Jagal Tak Terkalahkan is not of thrilling combat, but of an exhausting, necessary transaction carried out under the oppressive weight of circumstance. The narrative subtly weaves in the influence of martial arts cinema's past, but filters it through a lens of economic realism, suggesting a critique of romanticized depictions of combat. While earlier generations of Asian action cinema often celebrated discipline, spiritual enlightenment, or nationalistic fervor as the driving force behind mastery, here the mastery is purely pragmatic. The protagonist's skill set is not cultivated in a pristine dojo under the guidance of a wise master. It is forged in alleyways and improvised training spaces, honed by the necessity of immediate self-preservation rather than abstract philosophical pursuits. One might detect the ghost of older, grittier action stars who understood that true fighting prowess in poverty often meant adopting the dirtiest, most effective moves, irrespective of tradition or sportsmanship. This pragmatic approach extends to the depiction of injuries. Unlike mainstream action films where bruises fade quickly or broken bones serve merely as temporary plot devices, Jagal Tak Terkalahkan is unflinching in documenting the aftermath. The slow, laborious process of recovery, the visible limp sustained from a previous bout, or the visible scar tissue that narrates past defeats. These details function as a persistent tax on the protagonist's body and spirit. The film demands the audience confront the cumulative physical debt incurred by living this life. This realism is crucial because it anchors the stakes. The protagonist is not just risking a loss of a title. He is risking permanent physical damage that would instantly render him unemployable in his only available profession. The theme of mentorship, when it appears, is fraught with ambiguity. Any figure offering guidance is likely compromised, viewing the fighter as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be nurtured. If the protagonist seeks advice, it is usually transactional, a secret technique in exchange for a cut of the next purse, or protection offered under the implicit condition of future loyalty to a local power broker. These relationships highlight the absence of legitimate social safety nets. The protection sought is merely a substitution for official governance, often proving more predatory than the street itself. The film expertly dissects how desperation compels individuals to enter into deeply unequal power dynamics, where even perceived allies hold the leverage of knowing when and how to apply pressure. Ultimately, the film's refusal to offer a clean resolution becomes its most powerful statement. The ambiguity surrounding the protagonist's final success or failure, or whether true success is even possible within this confined system, leaves a haunting resonance. If he walks away with a win, the film implies that the system merely chewed him up and spat him out with a temporary reprieve, leaving the underlying social inequities untouched. If he loses, it signifies the brutal finality of the environment. This nuanced refusal to provide catharsis aligns the work with a tradition of cinema that favors exposing systemic truths over delivering satisfying, escapist conclusions, positioning Jagal Tak Terkalahkan as a sobering social document disguised within the framework of a brutal fighting picture. The psychological toll on the protagonist is further illuminated by the fleeting, almost spectral presence of his female counterpart, if one exists in the narrative framework. Often, in these tales of brutal ascent, the relationship with a loved one serves as the fragile tether to a normal existence that is being systematically sacrificed for the sake of the ring. Her character is rarely given the same narrative space for complex motivation. She exists primarily as the embodiment of what the protagonist is fighting for: stability, respectability, or simply a future beyond the next fight night. Her scenes are typically characterized by unspoken tension, the forced smiles masking her fear when he returns battered, or the strained conversations where he carefully omits the true brutality of his day. This dynamic paints a tragic picture. His victories do not bring them closer to freedom. They merely buy them more time in the same cage. The bookmakers and handlers orbiting the central figure are fascinating studies in opportunistic parasitism. They represent the formalized structure of the chaos, the individuals who successfully leveraged an understanding of human desperation into a steady income stream. Their appearance often contrasts sharply with the fighters. They are clean, perhaps even wearing slightly better quality, though still cheap, clothing. Their hands, used for counting money and relaying threats, are conspicuously unscarred. These supporting players embody the system's true winners, those who profit from the blood spilled without ever having to endure the impact themselves. Their dialogue, often whispered and laced with veiled threats concerning debts or missed weigh-ins, reinforces the inescapable nature of the protagonist's contract to fight. Furthermore, the film might explore the subtle corruption within the officiating, if any formal structure exists at all. A referee or an appointed judge in these underground bouts often serves as an agent of the highest bidder or the most powerful backer present. Their impartiality is a facade easily dropped when a significant sum of money is on the line. This element introduces a layer of external manipulation that elevates the drama beyond simple physical contest. The protagonist is not just fighting his opponent, he is fighting the entire compromise structure designed to ensure the outcome benefits those already in power. Every referee's count, every forced separation, carries the potential for conspiracy, adding a paranoid undertone to the action. The visual metaphor of the sweat and grime adhering to the fighter's skin is meticulously maintained throughout. It's a deliberate cinematic texture. The film resists any attempt to dry its subjects off or make them appear pristine. This sustained visual commitment keeps the audience perpetually aware of the physical labor and degradation involved. When the protagonist finally manages a moment of quiet reflection, perhaps leaning against a wall in the aftermath, the lingering sheen of sweat and dirt serves as a badge of painful endurance rather than earned glory. It is the residue of a life lived on the razor's edge, a constant, visible reminder that in this world, purity of motive is secondary to the ability to endure the filth. This dedication to sensory overload cements the film's standing as an unflinching, socio-economically driven drama masquerading convincingly as a pure fight narrative. The film's dedication to documenting the protagonist's internal erosion is perhaps its most challenging aspect for a mainstream audience accustomed to clear-cut heroes. We witness moments where the sheer will to continue seems to override any remaining sense of self-preservation or dignity. There are instances where a blow lands that should, by any reasonable measure, stop the fight. Yet the protagonist pushes through, driven by an almost animalistic reflex honed by necessity. This pushes the analysis beyond simple athletic commentary. It becomes an examination of what happens when the human spirit is forced to prioritize immediate physical survival over long-term mental or spiritual well-being. The actor's commitment here is shown not just in executing the fight choreography, but in the subtle facial contortions during moments of sustained, dull agony, a clenching of the jaw, a momentary blankness in the eyes that suggest dissociation as a coping mechanism. The depiction of the audience, those shadowy figures funding and feeding off this violence, is masterfully handled through suggestion rather than explicit portrayal. They are rarely shown in clear focus, often serving as a collective, indistinct mass in the background, their low, guttural murmurs or sudden explosive shouts functioning as environmental noise rather than individual reactions. This choice ensures that the audience's focus remains firmly fixed on the isolated suffering of the combatants. When the camera does occasionally whip around to capture the crowd, it is usually in response to a particularly brutal impact, suggesting that their only true engagement is with the spectacle of pain. This reinforces the idea that the protagonist is not performing for fans, but is a sacrificial element consumed by an unseen economic engine. The theme of honor in this context is a deeply corrupted concept. For the protagonist, honor is not about fighting fairly. It is about keeping one's word to those who hold power over him, fulfilling the transactional obligations that keep him alive for another week. Any display of traditional martial honor, showing respect to an opponent, fighting clean, would be seen as weakness, a sign that he hasn't fully grasped the ruthless dynamics of his profession. The film implies that true honor in this desperate sphere lies only in the ability to outlast the pressure, to remain solvent and intact until the next inevitable engagement. This cynical redefinition of a noble concept speaks volumes about the social strata the film is critiquing. Furthermore, the recurring motifs of confinement and limited space, the cramped changing areas, the small roped-off ring, the tiny rooms used for lodging, serve as visual metaphors for the protagonist's socio-economic trap. Even when he wins, and perhaps earns a temporary influx of cash, that money is immediately reinvested into survival mechanisms, paying off the handler, securing better temporary lodgings, or obtaining crucial medical attention from unqualified sources. The film resists the temptation to show him buying a vehicle or escaping to a better neighborhood. Instead, his wins often translate only into the maintenance of his current, undesirable status quo, suggesting that true escape from the fight circuit requires a quantum leap in opportunity that is simply unavailable to him. The narrative structure thus becomes a slow, agonizing process of attrition, where the only victory is the postponement of the final, inevitable defeat. The lingering emotional shadow cast by the film is one of pervasive paranoia, a constant state of vigilance that permeates even the brief moments of supposed respite. This isn't the focused adrenaline rush of a prepared soldier. It is the twitchy, jumpy awareness of prey that knows the predator is always near. The protagonist's inability to fully relax is subtly conveyed through his posture when off the canvas. Shoulders perpetually hunched, eyes constantly scanning entrances or shadows. A physical manifestation of the ever-present threat of betrayal or sudden violence from handlers, rivals, or creditors. This high alert state is the unseen cost of being unbeatable, demanding a cognitive taxation that likely burns out his capacity for long-term planning or genuine connection. The film's technical proficiency in capturing these nuanced states of anxiety is noteworthy. The use of deep focus in background shots during conversations often reveals hidden figures observing the protagonist, figures who remain silent but whose presence communicates surveillance. This directorial technique mirrors the protagonist's own internalized surveillance, suggesting that his perception of being watched is, in this environment, an accurate reflection of reality. It's a narrative device that elevates the world from merely dangerous to fundamentally untrustworthy, implying that true safety is an illusion reserved for those outside this brutal economy. The film's implicit critique of masculinity under duress is another compelling thread. The fighter is forced to equate physical aggression with worthiness and survival. Any expression of vulnerability, a plea for mercy, a display of uncertainty, or any reliance on external help beyond the transactional, would shatter his constructed persona and immediately strip him of his value in the market of underground fighting. Consequently, his masculinity is forged in fire, but it is a brittle, functional construct designed solely for combat and endurance, utterly divorced from any concept of healthy self-expression or emotional intimacy. This portrayal offers a stark counterpoint to idealized versions of strong male protagonists, showing strength as a necessary cage rather than a source of freedom. Finally, the soundscape, beyond the impacts, frequently utilizes low-frequency humming or droning sounds during moments of quietude. This sonic texture, almost subliminal, functions like a low-grade electrical current running beneath the entire narrative. It suggests that the system itself, the network of gambling, debt, and localized power, is a massive, indifferent machine that never truly powers down. The protagonist is merely one component within this machine, replaceable at any moment. This pervasive, humming threat ensures that even when the screen fades to black, the audience feels the oppressive weight of the environment refusing to release its grip on the central figure, leaving the viewer with a profound sense of inescapable structural confinement. The narrative often employs the motif of shared water, or the lack thereof, as a potent symbol of class division and communal struggle. Scenes depicting the preparation for a fight might show the protagonist sharing a lukewarm, often gritty bucket of water with his trainer to rinse off the dust and dried sweat, an act of forced, temporary intimacy born from necessity. This contrasts sharply with any implied existence of the handlers or bookmakers who presumably have access to clean, running water and modern comforts. This elemental detail serves as a constant, physical reminder of the protagonist's low standing. Even basic human needs are met with scarcity and degradation, further emphasizing the transactional nature of his existence. The protagonist's internal monologue, though often silent on screen, can be inferred through his repetitive physical rituals. Before entering the pit, he might engage in a specific, almost superstitious routine, a particular way of taping his hands, a precise sequence of stretching movements. These actions are not just preparation, they are attempts to impose order on chaos, a psychological armor against the randomness of violence. An actor portraying this role must convey that these rituals are the only things truly owned by the character, small acts of self-determination in a life otherwise controlled by others' demands. Any disruption to this routine, perhaps caused by a handler rushing him, visibly throws the protagonist off balance, hinting at the fragility of his mental state. The depiction of the local medical support, if present, is almost invariably substandard, functioning as another layer of exploitation. The doctor or medic tending to severe wounds is likely someone with rudimentary knowledge, operating without licenses or proper equipment. The cost of even this minimal care is astronomical, immediately plunging the fighter into deeper debt, regardless of whether he won or lost the bout. This forces the protagonist into a terrible dilemma. Ignore life-threatening injuries and risk permanent disability, or seek inadequate treatment and guarantee prolonged financial bondage. This highlights the film's core argument. The system is designed not only to extract physical labor, but also to perpetually extract financial resources from those who participate. Furthermore, the film masterfully uses fleeting glimpses of legitimate society. A brightly lit convenience store seen through a grimy window, a passing car that looks expensive, the faint sound of celebratory music from a distant, wealthier neighborhood to punctuate the protagonist's isolation. These moments are swift and jarring, acting like sharp pinpricks to the viewer's sympathy. They underscore what is being fought for in the abstract, a chance to participate in normal life, while simultaneously confirming, through the protagonist's inability to engage with these scenes, that the fight itself is the primary barrier to accessing that life. The fight is the symptom and the cure, simultaneously trapping him and offering the only temporary means of sustenance, a true tragic loop. The pervasive sense of fatalism hanging over the protagonist is inextricably linked to the film's refusal to depict clear mentorship or redemption arcs. Any experienced fighter seen in the background, perhaps older, visibly damaged, and serving as a grim warning, functions not as a guide, but as a prophecy. This veteran figure exists solely to illustrate the terminus of the protagonist's current path, a life of perpetual low-level injury, addiction, or dependence on the very handlers who currently employ the younger man. The protagonist might avoid direct eye contact with this spectral future, sensing that acknowledging it is akin to signing his own expiration date. This lack of a positive role model underscores the idea that this world offers no ladder for ascent, only a series of precarious footholds before the inevitable fall. The physical spaces used for training often mirror the psychological landscape of the film. If training involves shadowboxing against a wall, that wall is usually cracked, covered in peeling posters, or stained. The environment refuses to offer any clean canvas upon which the fighter can project his ambitions. Even the simplest tools, a set of worn hand wraps, a moldy punching bag hanging unevenly, are characterized by disrepair, suggesting that even the apparatus of his skill development is inherently compromised by the economic neglect surrounding him. This environmental storytelling reinforces the narrative that competence, too, must be achieved through grit, overcoming substandard conditions. The film often introduces a moment of false hope, usually tied to a specific, high-stakes fight, promising a payoff large enough to buy temporary freedom, perhaps enough to relocate, start a small legitimate business, or pay off the most dangerous debt. The tension surrounding this particular match is amplified through meticulous pacing, slowing down the lead-up to near unbearable speeds. However, the narrative architecture almost guarantees that this hope will be brutally extinguished, not necessarily through defeat, but perhaps through interference. The fight being stopped prematurely by authorities who only care about closing the illegal operation, or the payoff being confiscated by the handler under a spurious pretext. This structural betrayal confirms the film's cynical worldview. The opportunity for escape is manufactured only to deepen the participants' subsequent despair. Emotionally, the protagonist's few moments of genuine, unguarded expression, perhaps a slight softening when looking at an old photograph or a brief lapse in focus caused by a memory, are immediately punished by the narrative, often resulting in a quick, sharp reprimand from his manager or a sudden physical reversal in the ring. The film seems to argue that sentimentality is a luxury that individuals in this economic stratum cannot afford. To feel deeply is to become vulnerable to exploitation. Thus, the successful performance as the unbeatable fighter requires not just physical toughness, but a comprehensive, self-imposed emotional amputation, leaving only the necessary reflexes for survival and aggression. The victory is always Pyrrhic, paid for with pieces of the soul. The lingering sense of the protagonist's alienation is sharply defined by the way he interacts with sound beyond the immediate vicinity of the fight. Ambient noise from the outside world, a distant siren, the muffled sound of regular traffic, the faint music from a legitimate venue, is always presented as distorted, attenuated, or painfully loud against the close-quarters reality of the fighting den. This auditory filtering creates a psychoacoustic barrier. The world of normal life exists, but it sounds like it's happening underwater, unreachable, and irrelevant to the immediate life-or-death calculus occurring within the makeshift arena. This technique, visually and orally, isolates the fighter, making his suffering feel both intensely personal and utterly insulated from broader societal concern. The characterization of the protagonist's inner circle often revolves around varying degrees of forced intimacy and mutual exploitation. The trainer, who might be a former fighter himself, is seldom portrayed as a benevolent sage. Instead, he embodies the necessary cynicism required to shepherd another through this system. His advice is pragmatic, aimed solely at maximizing profit or minimizing immediate physical risk to the asset, not the man. When the trainer shows concern, it is almost always linked to the fighter's monetary value. A worried look isn't about the concussion, but about losing the next scheduled fight because of it. This dynamic paints a bleak picture of human connection reduced entirely to utility. Every relationship is a contract written in sweat and deferred payment. Furthermore, the film's visual language frequently utilizes reflections, often distorted ones, in puddles, on wet, oily floors, or in cheap, cracked mirrors backstage. The protagonist rarely sees a clear image of himself. He sees fractured, distorted versions, emphasizing his fragmented identity. These reflections become moments where the facade of the unbeatable machine momentarily cracks, allowing a glimpse of the exhausted human beneath. These visual motifs are crucial in denying the viewer the simple pleasure of identification with a triumphant hero. Instead, the audience is forced into a state of perpetual critical distance, observing a tragic process rather than cheering a champion. The finality of the protagonist's physical commitment is underscored by scenes dedicated to the aftermath of severe beatings when he is entirely stripped of his fighting gear. Stripped down to near nudity, perhaps shivering in a cold, confined space, the visual focus shifts entirely to the sheer architecture of his damage, the bruising, the slow seepage of fluid, the way his body moves with residual pain, even in repose. This deliberate exposure strips away the theatricality of the fight itself, leaving only the raw biological consequences. It is in these moments of near helplessness that the film's emotional power peaks, forcing the audience to confront the non-glamorous, agonizing reality that fuels the unbeatable moniker, a reality maintained only by sheer, stubborn refusal to collapse entirely. The film suggests that true invincibility here is measured only by the body's capacity to absorb punishment before it finally, irrevocably breaks. The film's pacing, when not focused on the brutal immediacy of combat, often settles into stretches of suffocating stillness, allowing the weight of the environment to press down on the character. These quiet interludes are characterized by extremely slow, deliberate camera movements, long, agonizing pans across dusty, unchanging interiors, or static shots where the protagonist simply sits, waiting. This stylistic choice serves to externalize the internal monotony of his existence. For an audience accustomed to constant narrative propulsion, these slow-burn moments can feel uncomfortable, yet they are essential. They force the viewer to experience the sheer boredom and existential dread that accompanies a life where every day is simply a prelude to the next necessary act of violence. The concept of the unbeatable title is cleverly subverted through the depiction of his rivals, who are not necessarily physically superior, but often sociologically better protected. A rival who appears slightly less skilled might inexplicably win a bout due to a timely distraction orchestrated by the handlers, or the referee suddenly developing an acute interest in the legitimacy of the protagonist's raps. This narrative thread suggests that in this ecosystem, competence is secondary to political maneuvering. The protagonist's strength is only effective until it intersects with a stronger, unseen financial influence, transforming every fight into a complex, layered negotiation rather than a pure test of skill. This systemic rigging prevents any sense of pure, earned victory, further embedding the theme of entrapment. The protagonist's relationship with physical objects often speaks volumes about his psychological state. He might exhibit an unusual level of care for a single, worn-out item, a cheap lighter, a faded photograph, or a particularly resilient pair of boots, while discarding or ignoring anything that signifies luxury or comfort. These few possessions become totems of his former or desired identity, tangible anchors in a fluid and dangerous reality. The way he handles these objects, with reverence, meticulous cleaning, or careful storage, is often the only visible outlet for a tenderness that cannot be expressed toward human beings, as human connection is too risky. Moreover, the film's commitment to verisimilitude extends to the handling of victory celebrations, which are almost non-existent. A decisive win is immediately followed by the grim business of collecting a fraction of the promised purse, often in cash that is sticky or visibly old, immediately being scrutinized by the handler for any potential discrepancies or fees. There is no roar of the crowd that translates into joy. There is only the transaction. The protagonist seldom raises his hands in triumph. He simply lowers his guard slightly, perhaps taking a deeper, less panicked breath. This anticlimactic reception to success solidifies the film's commentary. In this world, survival is the only celebration, and it is always fleeting, ensuring that the audience understands that the narrative is not about climbing a ladder, but about treading water in increasingly turbulent seas. The emotional resonance of the protagonist's struggle is deeply tied to his forced relationship with silence and noise, a sonic dichotomy that mirrors his inner conflict. When he is alone, the silence of his meager lodgings is not peaceful. It is oppressive, filled with the echo of past impacts and the anticipation of future ones. In these moments, the absence of external stimulus forces his internal monologue, that negotiation between survival and soul, to become agonizingly loud. He is haunted by the unheard pleas, the moral lines he has already crossed, which manifest not as auditory hallucinations, but as a dull, constant pressure behind the eyes. Conversely, the cacophony of the fighting den is deliberately chaotic, designed to fracture concentration. The director ensures that during crucial moments of strategic contemplation, ringside, the sound design layers disparate, grating noises, the clinking of betting chips, the shouted, incomprehensible arguments of gamblers, the incessant, uneven bouncing of a discarded ball in a corner. This auditory assault prevents the protagonist from ever achieving the clear-headed focus typical of idealized fight narratives. His unbeatable status is thus maintained not through flawless mental clarity, but through sheer, brute force resilience against environmental and psychological disintegration. The film masterfully uses the protagonist's physical appearance outside the ring to communicate his internal state to the viewer, bypassing dialogue entirely. His skin, perpetually tanned and scarred, takes on the texture of aged leather, a visual record of every blow absorbed. But more telling are the subtle signs of malnutrition and fatigue that no amount of cheap liniment can mask. The sunkenness around the eyes, the slight tremor in the hands when they are at rest, the way his cheap fabric clothing seems to hang slightly looser on his frame week after week. These details serve as a constant, grim narrative confirmation that the physical toll is cumulative and non-negotiable, eroding the very biological foundation that allows him to step into the ring. When interaction does occur with the few people he tolerates, the trainer, the cleaner, the bookie, the dialogue is clipped, functional, and almost entirely devoid of casual human language. Greetings are obsolete. Conversation revolves only around weight, time, money, or opponent profiles. This linguistic austerity is a defense mechanism, a deliberate starvation of connection to avoid the pain of caring or being cared for in a system that punishes sentiment. The profound emptiness in these necessary exchanges serves as a powerful commentary on the transactional nature of survival. When everything is commodified, even language loses its warmth and becomes merely another tool for coercion or commerce. The protagonist's silence in these exchanges is not arrogance, it is self-preservation through emotional withdrawal. The protagonist's few discernible moments of vulnerability are often triggered by banal, unexpected stimuli, shattering the carefully constructed emotional armor he wears. A specific scent, perhaps the aroma of frying onions from a distant street vendor, or the smell of cheap industrial cleaner, can momentarily transport him, triggering a visceral, non-combative response that is quickly suppressed. These sensory flashbacks suggest a buried past, a life before the inescapable gravity of the fighting circuit, but the film never lingers long enough to offer exposition. Instead, the reaction itself, a sudden flinch, a sharp intake of breath, or a momentary gaze directed toward an unseen horizon, is punished instantly, usually by the handler tapping him sharply on the shoulder, pulling him back to the immediate, toxic present. This reliance on sensory triggers reinforces the film's critique of memory in extreme hardship. Memories become dangerous liabilities, proof that a self exists beyond the function of the fighter. The protagonist's eyes, often described in earlier moments as vacant, sometimes exhibit a sudden, piercing clarity when exposed to these external prompts, suggesting a brief, desperate attempt to reclaim agency over his own internal landscape before the necessity of performance reasserts itself with crushing finality. The technical mastery extends to the depiction of the ring itself, which is rarely presented as a stable structure. Under the harsh, often singular overhead lights, the canvas appears perpetually slick, not just with sweat, but with an unidentifiable grime that seems to absorb the light. This visual instability makes the ground beneath the fighters feel untrustworthy. When they move, the camera often emphasizes the slight give or unevenness of the mat, suggesting that even the arena of supposed control is fundamentally flawed, mirroring the instability of the protagonist's own footing in life. Any triumph achieved on this surface is thus inherently precarious, resting on borrowed, unstable ground. Moreover, the film cleverly utilizes the absence of true medical expertise to heighten the stakes of the protagonist's injuries. When he receives treatment, The procedures are often invasive, crude, and swift, carried out in darkened rooms with makeshift implements. The sensation conveyed to the audience is one of violation rather than healing. This visceral discomfort ensures that the viewer understands that recovery is not a return to baseline, but rather a process of applying temporary, painful fixes to keep the commodity functioning. The protagonist's acceptance of this invasive care showcases the absolute capitulation of bodily autonomy. He is a machine being maintained in the field, not a human being being cared for. His silence during these procedures is profound, a quiet acknowledgement that this pain is simply the next, unavoidable payment due to the system. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Complex Cinema channel. If you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Today, we are going to discuss the movie Jagal Tak Terkalahkan nonton online. The screen flickers to life, immediately immersing us in the gritty, high-stakes world of Indonesian underground fighting, a place where reputation is currency and survival is a daily negotiation. We are introduced to Bima, a young man whose sheer physical presence hints at a history forged in rigorous training, perhaps stemming from a deep-seated need to prove himself in a society that often overlooks the invisible. His journey isn't merely about winning bouts, it's about navigating the treacherous landscape orchestrated by powerful, shadowy figures who see human potential only as a commodity. Bima's entry into this brutal arena seems almost predestined, a path illuminated by flashes of extraordinary, almost instinctual fighting skill. We soon learn he is mentored, or perhaps managed, by someone whose own past in the fighting world remains shrouded, suggesting a history of unfulfilled potential or past glories that now fuel his guidance of Bima. This mentor figure often speaks in clipped sentences, their wisdom born from hard-won experience rather than academic study, echoing the raw authenticity required to survive in the fighting circuit, much like a seasoned choreographer guiding a dancer toward their defining performance. The narrative tightens as Bima catches the eye of the untouchable kingpin, a man whose influence stretches far beyond the ropes of the fighting cage. This antagonist is portrayed with a chilling calmness, a man whose control over the underground economy mirrors the precision he demands from his enforcers. His empire is built on a complex web of debt, loyalty, and fear, a structure as meticulously planned as a grand strategic game. It's clear that capturing Bima's talent is crucial to maintaining this fragile power balance. As Bima rises through the ranks, each victory demanding a piece of his soul, the personal stakes escalate. We see glimpses of a life outside the ring, perhaps a family member in need, or a past transgression that needs to be erased, providing the emotional ballast that keeps him grounded, preventing him from becoming just another automaton programmed for violence. The training montages, often cliché in lesser films, here feel visceral, emphasizing the sheer physical toll and the relentless self-discipline required. Bima isn't just building muscle, he's hardening his resolve, drawing inspiration perhaps from national martial arts heroes whose legacy demands unwavering commitment. The core conflict builds toward the inevitable confrontation. Bima realizes that simply winning matches isn't enough. He must dismantle the system itself. His idealism clashes directly with the cynical pragmatism of the syndicate bosses. The final fight sequence is not just a display of athleticism, it's a philosophical battle. Every punch thrown is a rejection of the exploitation inherent in the underground scene. The choreography is sharp, relentless, reflecting the influence of master martial artists whose life work is dedicated to transforming combat into an art form, demanding perfect timing and devastating efficiency. In the denouement, Bima emerges, battered but unbroken. The victory isn't simply over his final opponent, it's over the system that tried to consume him. The ending suggests a hard-earned peace, a quiet understanding that true strength lies not just in the ability to fight, but in the wisdom to choose when and why to engage. He walks away, leaving the shadowed world behind, having carved out a space for genuine autonomy in a landscape designed to suppress it. It's a testament to resilience, a story whispered on the wind of the Indonesian streets about the fighter who refused to stay defeated. The atmosphere surrounding Bima is thick with unspoken danger, a tangible pressure that seems to cling to his worn training gear. His eyes, when not focused in the white-hot intensity of a bout, hold a deep, almost unsettling stillness, the kind that comes from having stared into the void of true desperation. One can sense that the initial spark that drove him to this life, perhaps a quest for honor for a disgraced family name, or the simple need to secure medicine for a loved one, has now transformed into a relentless, internal engine. He moves with an economy of motion, his physical training clearly rooted in disciplines emphasizing practical application over flashy display, reminiscent of old-school fighters who understood that flash fades, but solid fundamentals endure. His manager, who we might imagine having a past involving a near-miss career in international cinema fighting, now channels all that raw potential energy into Bima. This mentor often carries the weariness of a man who has seen too many promising careers dissolve into tragedy or corruption, offering advice like cryptic warnings against the temptations of easy money and the false promise of loyalty from the syndicate. There's a palpable tension between the manager's cautionary history and Bima's youthful, almost reckless optimism, a dynamic that keeps the audience constantly wondering if the mentor's past failures are about to become Bima's future reality. The main antagonist, the unseen puppet master controlling the tournament circuit, exudes a type of power that doesn't rely on shouting or visible aggression. He operates from impeccably sterile environments, a stark contrast to the blood-soaked canvas where Bima earns his living. This villain's inspiration seems drawn from ruthless modern business moguls, viewing human conflict as pure arbitrage. He enjoys the intellectual game of manipulation, seeing Bima not as a threat, but as his most valuable, albeit volatile, asset. The closer Bima gets to the top, the more intricate the web of psychological traps becomes, designed less to physically defeat him, and more to break his moral compass. As Bima racks up victories, the film allows us intimate, fleeting moments outside the arena. Perhaps we see him sharing a quiet, traditional meal with an elderly relative whose pride in him is tempered by fear for his soul, or maybe a brief, almost painful interaction with a former love who represents the simple, honest life he has sacrificed. These emotional anchors are crucial. They illustrate that the fight is never just for a purse, but for the right to reclaim a normal existence. The physical toll is evident in the constant wrapping of hands, the subtle limp that never quite goes away, the exhaustion that lingers even after a win. The climax approaches with the inevitable realization that the game is fixed at the highest level. Bima's escalating fame means his victories are now funding the very system he despises. The final confrontation is framed as a deeply personal reckoning. We sense the influence of legendary Indonesian martial arts cinema, where the fight scene is often the culmination of character development. Every block and every counter signifies a moral decision made